Welcome to our session where we're going to talk about innovation and diversity in economies that are dependent upon one natural resource or another. My name is Mike Clare. I am the Associate Director for Public Policy at the Harris Center here at Memorial. Very happy to be your host. A couple of housekeeping items for those of you who are here with me in the business building, the boardroom of the Faculty of Business Administration. If you have a cell phone or anything that could beep or buzz, I'd appreciate it if you set it to the silent mode. Washrooms are outside the door, and then turn left down the corridor, and male and female washrooms are down the hall. In terms of emergency exits, don't use the elevator that most of you came in, but there's a stairway just outside to the right as you leave this room. Should that be blocked, go to the end, go through the dean's office, kind of tilt towards the left. There's another exit from there. We're going to circulate a sign-in sheet, which I think is already in circulation. I would appreciate if you would sign that. It tells our finance and admin people that you indeed ate the lunches that you ordered with. I'm sure our guests won't mind if you help yourself to food and drink at any time. Please go help yourselves. We hate to have leftovers. And a copy of the presentation is going to be mailed out to you afterward, emailed out to you, so you don't need to take copious notes. Our speaker is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you guys for the Q&A session. So we're talking about, as I mentioned, entrepreneurship, innovation, and diversification during times of crisis, challenges and opportunities for Newfoundland and Labrador. This session draws on research conducted by our guest speaker on technology entrepreneurs in St. John's and Aberdeen over the past year, and explores the challenges and opportunities facing entrepreneurs in St. John's who are looking to enter global markets and develop innovative products. So I'm going to introduce Ben in a second, but I want to thank Cedric. Cedric, raise your hand. For arranging, due to Cedric, that this session is happening. So thank you very much, Cedric, for that. And just to give our speaker a sense of who is in the room with us, why don't we just go around? And Mike, let's do now that you're eating, I'd ask you to start and introduce yourself.
Thank you. It's Michael Skipton, Faculty of Business Administration.
Rhonda Tulk-Lane, St. John's Board of Trade.
Leslie Galgay, St. John's Board of Trade.
Morgan Murray, the Office of Public Engagement at Memorial.
Mark Shrimpton with Stantec Consulting.
Melissa Coombs, Business, Tourism, Culture and Rural Development.
Taylor Parsons, BTCRD. Michelle Clote-Visser, Business, Tourism, Culture, Rural Development.
Steve Young, Subsea 7.
Sinika Okla, grad student at MUN.
Carrie Neal, economics student at MUN.
Erin Keogh, and I work in areas of rural internet and its applications.
Richard Boczkowski, retired federal public servant.
Tony Martin, biochemistry, Memorial.
Dana Feltham, socioeconomic consultant and full-time MBA student.
Mona Rossiter, consultant.
Ted Lohman, Newfoundland Labrador Environmental Industry Association.
Ken Carter, Grenfell Campus Office of Engagement.
Cedric Brunel, Department of Geography, Memorial University.
Barry Snow, most recently Managing Director of the Oceans Advanced Ocean Technology Cluster, currently interested citizen.
Max Rulak, Independent Oil and Gas Consultant.
And Max is also the chair of the Harris Center's Advisory Board, so welcome, Max.
Gordon Slade with the Shorefast Foundation, Fogo Island.
And I'll introduce Ben in a second. Why don't we pass it to Trevor in the back there?
Trevor Brown, Faculty of Business.
Blair Windsor, Faculty of Business.
Jerry Lynn Mackey, VOCM News.
John Duke, Director of M5 and Board Member on Newfoundland Labrador Credit Union, and with Choices for Youth as the Chair.
And Taylor, you can say who you are too.
I'm Taylor Stocks. I'm with the Harris Center. It's pretty odd listening to myself speak in my ear while I'm doing it.
And Jennifer McVeigh is also here from the Harris Center. So that's, and we have how many online, Taylor?
Currently, we've got 5 people with us online. We've got Julia, Kylie, Lynn, Robert, and Vicky.
Okay, and welcome those 5 of you who are watching online. Let me introduce Ben, and I'll refer to my notes, just to make sure I got it right. Oh, by the way, Ben also wrote a white paper that we have loaded on the Harris Center's website. And so please, I think it's based on the presentation here. I think there's a lot of overlap, but you can download that from the Harris Center's website. We're going to be uploading the video of this session in a day or so. And as per our normal practice, we upload the video, we archive the video portion only. We don't archive the Q&A session. So you can be as candid as you want during the Q&A. That part of it is not going to be archived for future reference. And we're going to finish at 1:30 Newfoundland time. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Ben Spiegel is a Chancellor's Fellow and Assistant Professor at the University of Edinburgh Business School. He received his PhD in Economic Geography in 2013 from the University of Toronto, where his thesis dealt with entrepreneurial innovation in Calgary, Waterloo, and Ottawa. His research interest focuses on early-stage technology entrepreneurship and the role of regional cultural outlooks, institutions, and policies in creating supportive entrepreneurial environments. He's currently investigating the structure of entrepreneurship in offshore oil regions, such as Aberdeen and St. John's, as well as the formation and transformation of entrepreneurial ecosystems in Canada and the UK. So Ben, very delighted to have you here, and we'll turn it over to you.
Do I need to turn this thing on?
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Perfect. So first of all, thanks for hosting this. It's really important for me to actually feed back what I research to the community and get your input, because essentially I was here for 2 months, which is really not enough to understand what's really going on, but it was worth a shot. What I'm going to be talking about today is the role of entrepreneurship and innovation in diversifying economies like St. John's that are heavily dependent on a single industry, in this case, offshore oil and gas. What I've been doing for the past about 2.5 years is looking at these types of economies, so in Aberdeen and St. John's, to look at how do entrepreneurs within the oil sector, but also outside it, start businesses, grow them, and more importantly, get the kind of economic diversification that moves regions from being dependent on simply extracting local resources and then sending them up somewhere for processing and high value add, to both higher end activities in the sector, so design, innovation, management, but also to totally different sectors, and really to move the economy away from depending on just what you're pumping out there to really engage with the global economy. So first of all, I'm going to talk about who I am, why I'm doing this research, talk about why this is important. So why are entrepreneurs important people to talk about in an industry that's really all about billion-dollar capital investments, and their role as innovators and diversifiers. I'm going to give you an introduction to my research, give you an overview of what I found, and then I think what's more important is to really talking about the barriers and opportunities I've identified in the St. John's region. And then in the Q&A, really talking about options that we have to address the barriers and take advantage of the opportunities, given that it's a very uncertain time in both the local economy, but also the global oil and gas industry. So who am I and why am I studying this? I study crisis, not because I want to, but because every single industry I investigate collapses within 6 months of me studying it. For the beginning of my PhD, I began my PhD that was originally studying innovation in Ontario's automotive sector 8 days after Lehman Brothers collapsed. My first interview that I booked, I felt very proud of myself. The company no longer existed the 2 weeks later when I was going to speak with them. So that was my first introduction. My dissertation eventually focused on innovation in Waterloo with a focus on BlackBerry, and we know how that's gone. Right now, I'm studying innovation in sort of high-tech digital economies, which means that there's going to be a collapse in the venture bubble. But then, the research I'm doing right now has been really focusing on research in the offshore sector, which I began in September, basically August 2014, when oil prices were at record highs, when the economies were very booming and everywhere. And about 6 months after that began, we know what happened. And I was actually here, I would say October, November 2014, so right as it was happening. And so it gives me very interesting perspective on how economies react during these situations. And so it's not a fun thing to investigate, but it has a lot of importance, and that's why I don't mind the streak as much as the people who are in it. But so what I began this research on was this basic question of resource regions, which I'm going to really use the term to mean regions that have a big offshore oil and gas or onshore oil and gas. In a lot of ways, they have a whole lot of advantages, as we know. A lot of money flows into them. You could see the effects just here on Water Street, but anywhere you see the huge amount of money, but also the huge amount of human capital. The upskilling of local workers, and then the attraction of very high-skilled engineers, managers, scientists to the region from elsewhere. Those are the two big things economies need to succeed. They need human capital and financial capital. And so we should see in these economies a huge blooming of entrepreneurial diversification, that entrepreneurs should be able to take advantage of all the new opportunities using these financial and human resources. But we don't see that. And there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, this is something that, again, we expect to see these regions sort of stuck in their tracks. We know in developing countries, we have a resource curse where the political institutions of a region develop in a way that really prevent any kind of long-term economic growth and diversification. But even within more developed economies, we have this concept of Dutch disease, where essentially the effects on the currency and the industrial structure make it very difficult for the region to get out of its current state. And so that was this question that I'm really interested in, is how can regions like St. John's, like Aberdeen, leverage this amazing concentration of really, really smart people and a lot of capital to help them move away from depending on just local production to both engage with the global oil and gas industry, but also to move beyond it in a way that, say, Houston has, while still being a big center for oil and gas, is also a huge center for life science and digital technology. How can we use those smart people, that money, that opportunity to help these regions become more resilient in the long term? So again, and this isn't a new question. Canada's preeminent political economist, and so this is where I have a PhD, so I'm forced to teach you. Harold Innis really nailed this question back in the 1920s and 1930s. And he was looking at this question of the Canadian economy. Why does it never move beyond providing these low-value staples, as he called them? So start off beaver pelts, timber, cod, grain, oil, Justin Bieber, incredibly low-value exports. All the processing, all the important stuff happens elsewhere. So again, with beaver pelts, they were caught here, sent back to the UK to be made into fine hats. But all the economic value of those pelts comes from actually making them to hats. The trappers themselves made very little money. And you see this again with cod. The processing was always done elsewhere. You never got that huge value add that really moves economies away from depending on that. And so really what Innes said, to sum it up very quickly, is that when you have a resource economy like this, you're caught in these constant boom-bust cycles. When there's a huge demand for the resource, the money's too good not to invest in it. It's too easy to make money, and so you don't want to invest in anything else. And so there's no point in building a factory when you could just throw more money into getting the resource itself and shipping it out, because again, this is not because you don't know economics. It's a boom-bust cycle. You've got to get while the getting's good. And so you have all this huge incentive to invest now in getting the resource rather than this longer-term investment in processing and upskilling, in doing more economically valuable activities. And this was something Innes had seen basically from the start of European colonization of Canada, was this process going over and over and over again. And we still see it today in Alberta, Newfoundland, northern British Columbia, any place highly dependent on resources. It's very, very difficult to escape what he called the staples trap. And so this was a very early idea, but it's been developed further by economists, geographers, political scientists. And really how we view this is we call it evolutionary systems, that the past influences the present and it enables and constrains particular actions. So we're not these economic supermen able to make independent actions, with anything. We have sunk costs, we have implicit cultural biases, all these things from our economic, our social, our cultural past affects our future investments. And so especially in resource economies, what we see is that you have these institutionalized systems that make it harder to move out of our existing economic paths. And that's good in a lot of ways because it stabilizes what's going on now. For instance, Memorial has huge investments in pushing out really highly skilled engineers for the oil and gas industry. You need this because there's the demand for labor. Without those really skilled people, the industry wouldn't exist. But that means you have a lot of people trained in this particular industry that can't just move into any other field the second they want to. And so this perpetuates paths over time. And so we call this phenomenon lock-in, in that even though, we could bring all the economic development people and all the policy people and all the business experts in Newfoundland into the room and they could all agree we need to go in a different direction, you still can't because you're locked into this existing path and you can't escape it. And what we see around the world is that regional economies get locked into their particular paths until there's a big shock that knocks them out. And normally it's not a good shock, and normally they don't do better after this shock. What we see is that there's this constant resource bust or boom and bust cycle that the booms create this positive lock-in where there's a huge amount of growth and everyone wants to get in, and you build new buildings on Water Street to house all the new managers, you put new investment in the harbors to support it. There's a bust, you can't do anything about infrastructure. It's still there, so you've got to keep on working with what you have, and it makes it difficult to move out and diversify. And what we see from here is that there's sort of three potential options. So one, you could just continue persisting in this, enjoy it while it's good, mourn it when it's bad. But especially with oil, eventually that's going to go away. Eventually, the price is going to stabilize at a point below what's profitable for the offshore industry here, which is, as you all know, extremely high per barrel. And the economy is going to be where it was before the oil came, except with a lot of shiny new buildings that no one can afford anymore. Or we can look at this positive lockout, which me and Cedric are calling, which is essentially using those resources and using those skills that build up during this process to escape this cycle and create new economic trajectories. And while there's still obviously a huge place for the industry, you're not totally dependent on it, and there's other options for the regional economy. And so, again, just to give you the academic spin on this before we move on to the actual meat and potatoes of this, is we have these different options for a region driven by resources. You could have, in a place like, say, Aberdeen or Houston, you have a boom, but they're able to diversify over time. And so even after there's a bust, the economy still moves on because you have, in addition to the people just producing the oil, you have software engineers, you have developers, you have management consultants who are all selling globally. They're not tied to the local economy. And even though the region may sort of suffer during a bust, it can still recover and continue to grow. Or you could have this negative lockout where after the bust, there's simply no way for the region to recover. And again, this may be the future of Fort Mac, depending on how things go, but it's a place that will never be able to diversify because it didn't exist before the 70s, essentially. And so it doesn't have in my opinion, doesn't have the ability to create a diversified economy away from the tar sands. And so that's really the goal, is what we're looking for in regions like St. John's, like Aberdeen, is to get something like this, where you're not completely dependent on the resource, but you're able to use the human capital, the financial capital that builds up as a result of it, to catalyze larger and more sustainable and more resilient economic development. And entrepreneurs are key to this. Entrepreneurs, their entire reason of existence is to find new opportunities and to gather the resources they need to take advantage of it. And so they're real drivers of innovation because they're not tied to existing methods, markets, business models as the existing companies, and they could react much quicker to changes and take advantage of new opportunities. And so the Platonic ideal of this is basically this. This is, in some ways, this is a very easy way of looking at the Aberdeen story, is that at the beginning, before oil's found, it's a fishing town. After there's this first hint of discovery, the fishermen start renting out their boats to the explorers, basically, ferrying out sandwiches to them during the exploration. They move into maybe, say, where St. John's is right now, in a largely servicing economy. So you're servicing, helping to build, operate, maintain the platforms. But then you develop the skills in naval architecture, in systems development, and exploration, where you could sell that both locally but also globally. And so you move into rig operation, and then at maybe the heart of it is you're an exploration company, global exploration company, and you do high-end corporate financing. So the Wood Group in Aberdeen is a great example, where it literally was a fishing operation until the 1960s, when it was able to ride this wave, and now it's a multi-billion-dollar public company drawn on this success. And so when we think about this kind of diversification, this is an example of what we call related diversification, that they were using skills they already had to move into similar markets. So, if you're already a fisherman, you know how to sail, you know how to deal with rough weather, you can sell those skills to the industry. But there's also unrelated diversification, the same ability to, do ROV underwater foundation work or to do environmental monitoring through the oil and gas industry can just as easily be used to build wind farms. And that's what we call unrelated diversification, is that you're moving into a totally different industry. And so what we want is firms to build up new capabilities locally first, that they enter the market locally, because that's where the demand is, and they use that to develop skills that they could then sell globally, either in that same market, you're selling that same, that new ability within the market, or you develop new ones. So I was talking to companies here where they developed ROV for basically the St. John's, the geology offshore, realized the exact same thing is existing in the North Sea off the coast of Brazil. So you can sell that capability in new markets. Or you use that to develop totally new capabilities. I remember I was talking to one company, started off that was doing image processing for the fish industry. And they realized that that same thing could be used in fingerprint identification, and that there's a whole lot bigger market for police services than there is in cod processors. And so they use those existing capabilities to develop new technology for new markets. Again, all of these things diversify the economy, either by moving into new global markets, so getting away from St. John's into the global oil and gas industry, or moving into new industries that are either local or global, or going into totally things unrelated to oil and gas or local markets. But you develop those skills and you develop that reputation in the local market before going global. So all of these three routes are really important to how the region diversifies. And their ability to take advantage of all these different routes is crucial for building this kind of diverse, resilient regional economy based on entrepreneurial innovation. And so again, just to summarize, why should we care about diversification? And I don't think this is as difficult a case to make now than it was 2 years ago when the prices were high. But diverse economies are more resilient. They're not tied to a single price that is just beyond local control. And they allow you to move up value chains, to add more value, to increase profit margins, versus being controlled by a few major global players. And then finally, a diverse economy has more opportunities. Entrepreneurs can talk to each other, learn from each other, and that tends to create the kind of radical market-changing innovations that really catalyze economic growth for regions, that having that one success of a really great entrepreneur can really create new generations of entrepreneurs and move economies in ways that just a new firm coming to town could not do. So now I want to get to really the empirical data of what I was doing, why I was here. And so this was research focusing on St. John's and Aberdeen. And obviously, I think a lot of people know that there's a very, very similar story. Aberdeen is literally St. John's 30 years in the future. They had similar backgrounds as places really historically impoverished. I mean, Aberdeen going back 1300, Aberdeen not that much longer in the 1460s. Very similar background, fishing dominated by fishing and little else until the discovery of offshore oil and gas reserves. And like I said, you saw this evolution in Aberdeen from supplying just basic services, literally renting out fishing boats to sell sandwiches to the guys on the ships, to now companies like the Wood Group, locally based companies that are now public, multi-billion-dollar global operations. And in Aberdeen especially, but also in St. John's, we see the development of specialized white-collar and blue-collar workers for work on the shore, but also on land in terms of operations and maintenance, long-term investment. Unfortunately, Aberdeen, this has been a long process of declining supply. This is, the current crisis is not new to them. Since the peak at around 2000, it's declined by almost 2/3. With St. John's, we're now at basically St. John's in terms of the total production is now at the lowest levels of Aberdeen. I think right now it's slightly above. And again, just because of the way the geology works and the ways the market works. But in a lot of ways, they do have very, very similar historical trajectories. And so they're a really great case study to see what's going on and how they work. So just to give you some background on the study, my research started before the crisis. It became a crisis research, as most of my projects do after the fact. I'm really trying to catch up and see what was going on with them. But my focus was on entrepreneurs inside and outside the oil and gas industry, because this is, I think, the key to diversification, is seeing it both within this really strong industry vertical, but also entrepreneurs who are doing nothing related to the sector. They just happen to be born there or want to live there. And so they're operating in that environment. And I've talked to many of you in the room, additional interviews with investors, economic development officials, public policy people, just to get a better perspective of how it works. And so in all, this took place basically between 2014 and 2015. Talked to about 68 people, 32 here in St. John's, 36 in Aberdeen. Again, the bulk with entrepreneurs. And to give you a sense of who I was talking to, St. John's, the one life science firm, I'm sure you can figure out who it is, consumer tech, business-to-business technology, oil and gas and maritime, Aberdeen, similar industries, but in different numbers. And this was the big thing for me. And again, maybe this was I was talking to the wrong people. When you do qualitative research, it's all about who actually gets back to you by email versus who's actually there. But this is the huge difference. 16 companies, so about 60% of the companies I talked to in St. John's were directly in the oil and gas market versus 2 here. And now these 3 maritime companies, of course, they have business in the oil and gas sector. In some cases, that's their main factor, but they're not oil and gas companies, they're maritime technology companies. And so this was the biggest finding for me, and this is what shocked me, and I think this is room for discussion and where we could push this, is that I saw very, very few spinouts from existing oil and gas companies in St. John's. And so what I saw was that in St. John's, I talked to very few entrepreneurs who had a background in the oil and gas industry. Again, 2. Versus in Aberdeen, 15 had backgrounds in the industry. Only one of the people I talked to in the oil and gas industry didn't have a background in that. And that makes sense. This is an industry where you need the reputation, you need the social capital, you need the experience to get in. You can't go from the outside and expect to sell anything when the slightest mistake in your technology brings down a rig that costs several $100,000 an hour to operate. And so there are a couple reasons for this. And again, this is something I'd love to get your feedback on. One, the industry is younger here. Production didn't start till 97. Building the rigs didn't start till the 90s. So you don't have the same number of experienced managers and engineers that you have in Aberdeen, where you could have been working for 30, 35 years in the industry from the second you graduated college, and then eventually decide to leave, decide you want to own something, decide you finally want to strike it rich rather than just making money for someone else, and take all those knowledge, all that context that you built up outside. And so we may see this change now that there's been more time, now that we're finally hitting the 20-year mark. So someone who started the day the first rig started up is now hitting the 20-year mark of their career next year. Maybe this is the time they decide to leave. You sort of have this timeline maybe it's very predictable. But what we really do see are cultural barriers to entrepreneurship in St. John's. And this is a pretty common thing you see in a lot of places, that why would anyone leave a job that pays 6 figures, that's pays $200,000 a year, to take the risk of starting your own company? There's just not the point, especially in a place like St. John's, where you just have this history of poverty. And these people know what it was like to be poor, and they don't particularly feel the need to go back to that. And so now this may change now that there's layoffs. We call this opportunity cost. And so when you have a job, there's a huge opportunity cost and a huge risk of quitting and leaving to start your own company. When you've been laid off or that's coming, it becomes a lot easier. So maybe we'll see this change, but this is a huge number to deal with. And this is something that needs to be better explained, is why do we see these very low rates of spin-off creation by people with a background in the oil and gas market? What I also saw was that it was difficult for companies in St. John's to sell into the supply chain, the local supply chain, but also global supply chains. And so again, there are companies that aren't oil and gas that are still selling into the oil and gas supply chain. And so we saw that about 40% in St. John's were versus 65 to 70% in Aberdeen were in some way selling, a good portion of their annual turnover to the oil and gas. And what you can really see this is that this is, in my opinion, a reflection of the changing nature of the global oil and gas industry. That right now, BP, Exxon, Husky would much rather cut a check to Schlumberger or Halliburton to build something rather than go a local entrepreneur who knows the technology, who knows the need, because a lot of them just have a straight up limit. I know that BP has a straight up limit on the number of contractors they can have. And so if you work with a small company, you've got to cut another one. And I think other companies have this limit, but it adds risk. And I believe a lot of entrepreneurs told me was just that you've got to know someone and they've got to take a big risk on you. You've got to know an executive at Husky if you want to sell to them. And that executive is putting their reputation on the line by even working with you instead of just cutting Halliburton a check for 3 times what the entrepreneur would have charged. And that becomes a barrier because these local sales are the way firms build up their reputation, and that helps them go global. And if they can't make these initial sales, they can't move up that value chain and eventually sell globally, use that resource to fund more R&D, to move into other industries. And again, because we're seeing fewer entrepreneurs from the industry move into entrepreneurship, they don't have those networks, they don't know that executive, they haven't worked with that executive before, and they don't have that ability to get someone to take a giant risk on them. Versus Aberdeen, it's much more normalized to work with small businesses. You could always work for another tier 3 supplier, build up your reputation. It becomes much easier to enter that supply chain because they're just it's a larger market. And so there's a bit better news in terms of entrepreneurs diversifying into new geographic markets, so moving into new regions versus just selling locally, and entering new industries. So for one, St. John's businesses were much more likely to enter new sectors and industries versus ones in Aberdeen. The reason for this, pure money. You can make a whole lot more money charging for your work in the oil and gas industry than anywhere else. And a lot of entrepreneurs in Aberdeen basically told me that, their order books were filled for 5 years. That has obviously changed, and a lot of them are going to be trying to move into new markets now. But again, when there's this boom cycle, when the money is good, there's simply no ability of an entrepreneur to move into a new industry because they don't have the employees. The labor market is too tight. There's not enough resources to do all the investment in R&D necessary to move into new markets. And what we saw, and again, this should not be unexpected to anyone who has talked to a St. John's business person, is that more businesses were born global, in that from the get-go, they started selling globally. Again, not the oil and gas companies, but the technology, the business-to-business technology, and consumer tech. They were all online from the start. They were all selling digital services from the start. And so a lot of them, they actually didn't enter new geographic markets because they were already global. They had no need to, target Europe because they were already selling there. And so in some ways, this is good because they're hitting this global market. But on the other hand, it reflects the smaller local market they have to sell into. And this is important for entrepreneurs because that's where they sort of learn the business. It's easier to find customers locally. It's easier to sort of move on from there. But on the other hand, with new digital businesses, there's no need to start locally. If you're a web-enabled software as a service company, there's no point just selling in St. John's. You're selling everywhere from the get-go. And again, a barrier to entrepreneurial innovation is the lack of finance, not surprising to anyone, but it becomes important. So first of all, what we see is that in Aberdeen, most entrepreneurs don't even bother. Again, when the time was good, and a lot of my interviews in Aberdeen were before the crash, just why bring on an investor when customers will give you all the money you need anyways? There's no need to bring in outside capital to do R&D because you can get your clients to prepay for that. What we saw in St. John's was that more people had looked and not found it. And this is, again, for historical reasons, also the nature of the companies. The first is that there's St. John's and Newfoundland more generally obviously has a very underdeveloped market for outside capital. There are essentially 2 angel investors and some other people following them. And really, as one technology entrepreneur told me, was that the majority of investors here don't know technology. Their money comes from real estate, it comes from running grocery stores, it comes from running gas stations, and they may want to become angel investors, but they don't have the skills. And that's what really how we separate what we call smart capital, which is investors who have contacts in the industry and know how to manage fast-growing companies, versus dumb money, which is just investment capital. And so without the population of angel investors with this knowledge, you can't get this virtuous cycle of investment leading to more investment, leading to more investment. And in some ways, there's not a whole lot of ways to solve this. People's experience is where their experiences is. And maybe the hope is that when Blue Drop eventually makes a very profitable exit, that money will stay here, that talent will stay here. And that is something that can catalyze a big growth in the investment scene. But it's one of these random chances. You have to hope it happens, and when it does, take advantage of it. But one of the areas of strengths is, I think, the strong attachment to community. And again, this is something you see here that you don't see in a lot of other places, and it's something to really be taken advantage of. So for instance, my research work in my dissertation was in Calgary. I've been doing work in Aberdeen. They have strong networks there. People talk to each other, but there's no trust in that because they're all in the same industry. They're all selling to the oil and gas sector, and they're afraid of helping anyone out because any advice you give to someone else, even your friend, is going to help them get a contract that you're going for. And again, because there are fewer oil and gas entrepreneurs here, but also just because of the trust and the fact that everyone does know everyone here, there is a lot more support for helping each other and really helping them even within the same industry. So again, one of the surprisingly many video game entrepreneurs and digital entertainment entrepreneurs here, again, grabbed lunch with 3/5 of the industry. There's 3 of them, but it's still 3/5 of the industry. And this is what I saw again and again in the interviews and bringing up the data, were these very strong networks. And again, the strong attachment to community. And even I saw this in the venture scene. The angel investors here really said they're investing to help the community. And just as they might if they were philanthropists investing in a new foundation, they saw investment not as be creative, they made back their money, but they're really seeing it as a way to build St. John's entrepreneur community rather than as a profit play. And again, that's something to be taken advantage. Not I say take advantage. That sounds bad, but that's a major strength of the region that can be built on. That again, we don't see in Aberdeen, we don't see in Calgary, and you're certainly not going to see in a place like Houston or New Orleans. And again, compare this to a technology entrepreneur I talked to in Aberdeen who was desperately trying to get together a community of other tech entrepreneurs. And he wasn't in the oil and gas industry. He was an app developer. And you couldn't get them to talk because everyone had at some point worked in the oil and gas industry and absorbed this industrial culture of distrust. And it made it difficult for them to even bring a community together to get a Startup Aberdeen movement going, just because they had this constant sort of fear of networking. And that, it leads to problems because the best way to learn about entrepreneurship is to talk with other entrepreneurs. And that's what builds a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's not state support, it's not the capital, it's entrepreneurs learning about entrepreneurship from other entrepreneurs. And that's what the strong attachment to community here can build. So all in all, St. John's has a lot of barriers to diversification. We saw it in especially the low levels of spin out, the lower levels of selling to the oil and gas industry. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this. Aberdeen lucked out in its history. It started selling before you could just cut a check to Halliburton for them to build whatever you want. And it, within the regional economy, created this culture and this institutional structure of small businesses moving into the oil and gas industry, selling, and then going global. We don't have that in Aberdeen just because at the time development started here, there was a much bigger dependence on these global tier 2 suppliers versus small companies. The production levels are smaller. There are 44 rigs working in the UK North Sea at any given time. There are 4 here. And even though they're huge and giant, the economies of scale mean that there's just fewer need for small firms to work. And then finally, you just had less time. 20 years is not enough to build your international reputation. Aberdeen has had double that in order to build these ties. And so you get this going out. So we'll talk about that in a bit, just because I only have about 5 minutes left. But right now, there are 3 big barriers to diversification in St. John's, even given the current crisis. So the first is the lack of a strong local market for the oil and gas. And so we can't depend on that. You can't just wait through, say, government procurement regulations to say, oh, they'll have to buy here, they'll create the market. It's never going to be big enough to create the kind of sustainable economic growth that Aberdeen has been able to use as a foundation. The lack of investment infrastructure is a problem. It's not something that we solve through government intervention. It needs these successes, these successful exits to bring in a new generation of skilled investors. And then I believe there's also the lack of just internationalization knowledge. There's been fewer people in St. John's who have gone global, and that knowledge, isn't traveling well in the community. But again, that can be addressed through these strong local networks we've been talking about. But it's very easy as an academic to be incredibly depressing because I don't have to come up with solutions. That's for you guys to do. But I did want to start to think through some potential, again, strengths to build on, areas that you can have successful interventions versus other areas where you can just continually throw money away. And again, this is the biggest strength. And it's one of these things that St. John's, Newfoundland is famous for, and it's not just the community to sort of sell to the tourism board. This is a strong business community that cares desperately about helping the region, and that's something to be taken advantage of. And I think there's a very strong community of entrepreneurs who share knowledge and support. We see with the sort of the growth of Common Ground and Startup Newfoundland, there is this community. They are really willing to work hard to build a strong network of entrepreneurs who actively help each other. That is key to developing a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem. We have a lot of successful businesses inside and outside of the oil and gas industry. Rudder, Pangeo, Virtual Marine Technology, Gray Matter, Blue Drop. And I think it's important to sort of concentrate on these ones outside it. So, I mean, Blue Drop, it's an e-learning company. It could be anywhere, but it's here. And it's here because the founders were born here and they want to build a life here. And I saw that in so many other entrepreneurs saying that, this is where they're born, this is where they expect to die, hopefully not for a while, but this is where they want to build a life, and building a business is part of building that life, and they want to create that. And again, this obviously the same thing with Rudder and Pangeo and Virtual Marine, but it's the tech entrepreneurs that can really help create this community of successful entrepreneurs that can help entrepreneurship within the oil and gas, but also outside. One would hope that the sunny side of the current crisis is that it creates a new generation of entrepreneurs. That doesn't always work. The people who get laid off, basically, they don't want to be entrepreneurs. You can't force someone to be an entrepreneur. They need to want it. And for a lot of people who get laid off, they're looking to replace an income rather than build a business. And so I've done a lot of research in Ottawa with laid off workers from Nortel. Turns out people who work at Nortel aren't the best entrepreneurs. It turns out the really successful entrepreneurs in Ottawa were from a generation later, people who weren't based in working for a big company. And so while there's certainly a lot we should be working with the people, these experienced managers and engineers, Ottawa made the mistake of saying, oh, all these people are going to be the next generation of telecom entrepreneurs. None of them were. The economic growth came from a totally different angle. So while there should be entrepreneurship training and support for this group, don't expect it to just happen through magic. And then finally, the advantage of being in a small community is that you're born global. And so it's important to really focus on these internationalization skills for entrepreneurs. Again, we really focus on impact in the UK and demonstrating impact. So I wanted to give you some quick wins. Policies I've seen in other places that I think could be very effective here. The first is, again, entrepreneurship training and advising for the oil and gas industry workers, but it needs to come from people who have experience in the industry. This is not something where you can get the same person who teaches how to open a small restaurant or how to file for taxes. You need someone who's been through it before, who's had a successful company, been through all the stages, knows how to sell into this very peculiar and very particular industry. They need to be leading the training, to be very careful, to be very specific to the industry and not generic startup support. The second one is to formalize processes to draw on the social networks of the diaspora. The Global Scot program in Scotland has been hugely successful because it's a strong community with global reach. And it's not an investment program, it's not a training program, all it is a Rolodex. And so any Scot entrepreneur who's moving into a new market, they know someone from the same background who they can get a phone call with in wherever they want to go, in the new market, in the new area. It's just that first phone call, that's all the program does. And it's been hugely successful because it helps remove these barriers and really gives people a step up to internationalizing. And I know I've talked to some people on the Board of Trade, I believe. There's some attempt at this. I would really say this is a really great way to take advantage of the strong community spirit with what is a very now globalized Newfoundland population. And then finally, organizations like Common Ground, Startup Newfoundland are critical to this. And sometimes it's just about pizza and beer money. And sometimes it's hard to justify in a government budget, especially in times of austerity. But this is something where you can do a large amount of very small investments, many of which won't work, some will succeed spectacularly. And it's sort of that openness to helping small groups get together, giving entrepreneurs a space and a forum, an opportunity just to get together and talk and learn from each other is crucial. And then finally, building for longer term success, figuring out who the key stakeholders are. So obviously we went around and introduced ourselves, a lot of people from government, a lot of people from industry. We don't see a lot of entrepreneurs because they probably have something better to do with their time, but they are key stakeholders in this, and it's important to bring them in. And one area I've been looking at is this term called adaptive co-management, which is taken from ecosystem management. So one of the great research has been on basically elk and Nunavut and trying to work with, how do you work with communities, many who have different goals, different experiences, different desires. How do you bring them all together into the room and get them to agree to a common vision? And that's what's important in St. John's entrepreneurial and sort of business community, is creating that sense of common vision and long-term commitment. It's very difficult, but again, building on these really strong ties we have in the community, that's something I think is eminently achievable. The lack of investment capital, like I said, is an issue. I know when I was here last, there was this big announcement of the VC investment, the government funding GrowthWorks to invest in Newfoundland. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. What I think sometimes is more important is just to let entrepreneurs know you're never going to get investment, plan around it. And this was something, they can do it because they had those skills. And so for instance, Shopify in Ottawa started at a time when there was no angel investment in Ottawa. All of them were wiped out by the 2000 crash. There was no angels, no VCs left. And now they're a public company because they planned. So at the early stages, they didn't depend on venture capital. They created their business model, they created the revenue model with that in mind, and they're able to succeed and basically put off getting investment until they could go to New York or go to a much larger established community for that, while obviously still staying in Ottawa. So I think it's easy for policy people to focus on trying to get more angel investors, trying to get more money into the region. Sometimes you have to admit that's not an option. Let's work around it. And then, like I said, adaptive co-management tools, a very interesting framework to really bring together a bunch of stakeholders into the same room and work with them to find solutions. So with that, I'd like to end. I'd like to just thank the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust for the research grant for this, and again, the Harris Center for providing the forum. And I look forward to getting a discussion going on this. Thank you.